and welcome to the World Citizen Global Teacher Civility Takeaway Lesson. This is lesson number 4, Dimensions of Culture. So we hope you've been following along. If you are in the Level 1 Global Teacher Program, there are 6 lessons, 5 and a bonus that comes with the Level 1 training certificate. And these videos are tips and inside scoops, a little bit more detail about how to use the lessons. So I hope you enjoy them. I'm going to skip now to the word version of the lesson. And here we are. This is about introducing real-life differences in culture. And so, as always, we recommend to you that when you are delivering these lessons, that you read the lesson in its entirety, first of all. Number 2, that you deliver the lessons in the order they are written. So each lesson can be, 1 to 1.5 hours, depending whether you give breaks or not, depending how old the children are. Sometimes we give a little bit more breaks. And you could also expand the lessons. You could combine 1 or 2 lessons, or you could add in some extra activities or things that you would like to do on your own related to the content as well. So, this lesson is about dimensions of culture. So, of course, the rationale and the baseline detail for each lesson is the same. The rationale is incorporated with every lesson. We're all citizens of the world, and so this is about the World Citizen program here and the reasons that we care about these topics and about promoting world citizenship in general. Each lesson contains this little grid that shows the learning objectives and that the lessons are for ages 5 to 10. And so in this lesson, we want children to understand what a factor is related to culture. So we use the word factor in place of the word dimension, just because it's a little bit easier for the young people to understand. So we want them, from a social competency point of view, to understand that there are real factors that exist. We want them to understand how and why some of these are valid differences when we talk about culture. And we want them to be able to describe, at least one difference. This is the individualism versus collectivism dimension of culture, which as a young child is something they can usually understand, but it will be critical as they get older, and they can build on knowledge of that one dimension or factor as they learn about other dimensions of factors. Other dimensions of culture. So, as we get into the lesson, with regard to 21st century learning framework, this content is important for children to understand about global perspective. They need to be collaborative and curious. They need to ask questions. They need to have superior communication skills, and part of that is built around cultural competence. So, and not just an awareness of culture, but a deeper understanding and acceptance of culture. So, there's different supplies. We provide some activities in the course. Recommended reading for the trainer, and in these global teacher lessons, we use the word trainer interchangeably, just so you're aware. So, if you decide to use this content for older children or for adults, this is the background of the Dimensions of Culture theory by Hofstadter. So, we do have a diagram here that is helpful for you to know. Generally, there are 6 key dimensions of culture, but we're focusing on the green one here, individualism versus collectivism. It's sort of this me to we viewpoint that is easy for children to understand, and it's quite prevalent and obvious in different situations, whether it's geographic culture or classroom culture, for example. So we encourage you to browse through all of the background sources and resources. There's some YouTube clips. We do provide some ideas for books that relate to diversity and so on. Some terms such as compassion, empathy, all the terms, there's a glossary, I believe, at the beginning of the Global Teacher course in the Online Learning Center. And a little bit of notes about lifelong learning, which, when we talk about cultural competence generally, the idea that we're continually learning is really a big part of that. So there's some fun things here, some books and resources. This hair everywhere. You know, we can learn about different hairstyle, different products, why some cultures grow beards and others don't so much. You know, the rituals about hair cutting and shaving of heads. Different blonde hair versus dark hair versus curly hair, etc. And hair is a big part of culture, and it's something that we can see on the surface, so most children can relate to it or understand it easily. Once again, you don't have to use the lessons exactly as they're written. If you're reviewing them and you feel there's something that might not be appropriate or might be sensitive to your audience, of course we encourage you to change the lesson in a way that makes it suitable for your group. So, you know, this hair everywhere, I like it because we can bring in all sorts of wigs and let the children play a little bit. We can show them how, you know, hair can be interesting or funny. You could have green hair or long hair or no hair. And it doesn't change necessarily what's under the hair, which is also an important piece of culture. Sometimes hair relates to where we live and climate and geography and lifestyle. So it's a way to introduce the idea that there's normally a good reason for cultural aspects, including this idea of a cultural dimension that we're going to get into further in the lesson. So once again, it's up to you whether you want to do it or not. We have used this in the past in our courtesy camp and found that it works really well. Children seem to really like it. So here is the grid that shows how to run the lesson. And again, it depends on your ages. It depends on how many children you have in class, how quickly they're taking up the content, whether or not you want to take more breaks or not. There's an activity for the classroom, a worksheet, some questions. So you might have to direct this, read aloud, and ask the questions, unless you have older kids, and sometimes you can put the older kids, pair them up with the younger one. So the idea here is we're introducing aspects of culture, and we want children to be able to see that there are many differences. None is worse or better than the other. We just want them to know that things are different. And then for a take-home activity related to the me or we concept, this dimension of individualism versus collectivism, we want children to take home a journal activity. And beside everything that they do, write a me or a we to help them understand what that particular dimension looks like in practice. So we reference that later on in the lesson too. And here are a bunch of terms to know. With the older children, you can use matching or puzzles or definition games and so on, whatever you might like to do. We want to make sure that we start the class always with name tags and let children introduce themselves depending on the confidence levels. And then we're going to get right into the lesson. So hopefully they've attended the first lessons and they have a sense of what culture is. They would have already learned about bias and assumptions. And now we're going to talk about also barriers. And now we're going to talk about a factor. So a factor, stated simply, is something that can change how we think or behave. And we're going to play, sorry, there's a typo here. We're going to play a weather person game and talk about some examples of factors that change how we think or behave. So in this case, what I like to do is to have a small desk area set up. Maybe there's a map or a background on it, and we have a microphone, a real one or a toy one, what we would call a set, almost like a television set. And children are going to take turns being the weather person, like on the news, and we maybe show a clip of a weather person or somebody in this situation by video so children can see what we're referencing. Like on the news, the children are going to take turns and tell what the weather will be like. And the instructor or the teacher is going to whisper a factor that the child will talk about. So you can have a jar maybe with different factors in the pieces of paper in the jar. Cloudy, sunny, rainy, thunderstorm, tornado, windy, all kinds of factors. And let the children draw one, or each one will get a different factor, and let them be the weather person and explain how the factor is going to affect people that day. As in, it's going to be snowy today. Don't forget to wear your boots and leave a little early because the roads might be icy, right? You can't ride your bike today. There's too much ice. Make sure you take a rain jacket. It's going to, we expect rain showers today. Those kind of things. So just let them play a little bit and have fun. We're trying to introduce this idea of a factor being something that influences how we think or behave. So when the weather person said it was going to snow today, snow is a factor because it changes how we think or behave. So, you can ask the children, give them an example, walk through it with them, and let them play the weather game. And then we're going to debrief that activity by explaining that there are factors related to culture that change how we think and act too. So the idea is to help children understand that cultural aspects are often a result of conditions and factors. They're not always in our control. And this is foundational for understanding culture. A good example is if I live in Iceland or Alaska or Russia, northern Russia, somewhere where it's cold, the weather is a factor that's going to impact how I dress. And if it's frequently cold, that becomes a cultural factor, that people always dress that way. If I'm somewhere where there's wind, maybe a hat or a face covering or scarf becomes that weather changes how I think or behave. And so it's a factor. So you can use images or videos or have the children act out scenarios, but the next thing is we want to help them understand some real-life examples of factors related to culture. So you might say to them, if someone lives in a country where there's lots of people and not too much room for people to have a big house, the factor, lots of people, is going to change how we think or act. So, for example, people might have small houses, or a lot of people might live together in one house. If someone lives in a country where there's not enough clean water or medicine, how is that going to how will that factor impact us? And we'll see that people might get sick or thirsty. So, again, we don't want to be too negative, but we want to introduce the idea that factors can be positive or negative, right? If someone lives in a country where the government is very strict, how will that change how we think and act? And the answer is that people will be careful to follow the rules. And if people live in a country where not everyone is treated equally, how will that factor impact us? And so here we're subtly introducing topics that we'll get into a little bit more detail with the older children or as we go further into the levels of the training. So we want to explain that sometimes we see people thinking or doing things a certain way, and we think they're bad people because that's different than we would do. But we want them to understand maybe there's a factor that's making the person think or act the way they do. Sometimes people can't decide what they want to do because the factor makes them think or be a certain way. So, again, related to 21st century learning, we want to ask questions and be curious and get to know people and the factors before we decide what's right and wrong. All right, and then after the break, we're going to look at one important factor that relates to a lot of people around the world, and this is called me versus we. So in some countries and cultures, people are taught that they, meaning each person, is the most important. Maybe the person lives somewhere where there's lots of everything to go around, so he or she's used to having everything. This is a me factor. It's not bad, it's just different than we factor. So in other countries, people are taught that all the people are the most important. So if someone has an orange, he would never eat the whole orange. Instead, he would automatically take it home and share with the whole family. This is a we factor. So for you as an adult trainer, of course, who's done the pre-work, you understand that me is individualism and we is collectivism. And this is a very common cultural dimension that differentiates cultures. So it changes the way people think and behave. And it's an easy one for children to understand, but I like to teach it first because it ties into civility. So we're going to ask children some questions, And we're going to ask them to tell us, is this a me or a we? There's some examples here in the lesson. You can review them, but one example: what if I am on the playground and I get to the swings first? I stay on the swing for a long, long time, even though I know other people are waiting. That's a me, right? And you're going to let the children guess, and if they guess incorrectly, we'll explain to them. And then we'll ask them, if I want to change that to a we, what would I do? And hopefully they'll say things like, just swing for a short time and give someone else a turn. That's a we, right? So there's a few examples written there. I encourage you to review and see if there are situations that make sense for you, that children can relate to, or should you come up with a few of your own. And I find children really like this. And sometimes we can do things like friendship bracelets, where every bead represents something different, or a friend or a group. Show them how with colors, a whole bunch of colors is we, where if I just pick one color, things are all the same, that's a me, right? There's different ways that you can make the point so children take away the key message. So what do you think helps us live better together? Me or we? And children will usually explain we. And this is a really important precursor to teaching the world citizen concepts of equality and equity and citizenship. We're all human and living on the planet together. We have to share resources. So this idea of we, kind of focused on what's good for everybody as opposed to what's just good for me, is a really critical message. And in closing here, there's the usual takeaway, this short quiz. For older children, you can send it home with them or use it as a way of opening the next session. And I would also say that when you are talking about this particular me to we, you want to emphasize that it's something that people ask or deal with all over the world. We're not going to highlight a particular culture, and we're not going to suggest that me is always bad, because of course in some cases we want to teach children further down the road that taking care of oneself is not selfish, it's about self-respect, and we'll get to that. So we just want for the moment people to understand, and by people I mean children in your class, to understand that we, from a world citizen point of view, is really a critical takeaway. Thank you.